Good afternoon, good evening, Shana Tova, Happy New Year. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. It is a real pleasure to welcome you here for our lecture today with Dahlia Scheindlin, Is Democracy in Israel Salvageable? I am pleased to welcome you to our program today on behalf of the Center for Judaic Studies at UConn and our co-sponsors from Middle East Studies and Jeremy Pressman specifically, and the Department of Political Science here at the University of Connecticut. It's truly an honor to welcome such a distinguished guest and commentator as Dahlia Scheindlin to be able to explain to us just what is going on in Israel now around the political situation and the so-called judicial reform, and also to tell us a little bit more about the history of this situation. I'm just letting people in. Just a couple of technical notes before we start the program. You will note that you have all been muted upon entry to the program. This is just to minimize disruptions and distractions during Dahlia Scheindlin's remarks today. We will also encourage you to submit questions using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. You can answer any questions you want at any point during the program, and we will leave plenty of time after Dahlia's remarks for Q&A and discussion, and I will moderate that and try to field the questions. So it's a great pleasure for us to welcome Dahlia Scheindlin, who is a political scientist, a public opinion expert, and a political consultant. She has advised 9 national election campaigns in Israel since 1999 and has worked in 15 other countries as well. In Israel, her research focuses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, foreign policy, democracy, human rights and civil rights, political analysis, and comparative conflict analysis. And I want to mention her newest book, which is also the occasion for this talk today, and which I believe the book launch day was yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see here I'm sharing a flyer for the newest book, which is called The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled, a narrative chronicle of democracy in Israel that defines historic phases within the global context and follows thematic challenges to democracy, including competition between religion and the rule of law, the statist society versus liberalizing trends over time, and the impact of ongoing military conflict, Israeli-Palestinian relations, and occupation. Dahlia Scheindlin's analysis reveals the deep roots of Israel's current crisis, but suggests clear paths towards reaching Israel's unfulfilled promise of democracy. And I'm sharing the flyer here on the screen. You will see that there's actually a QR code, which you can scan with your phone if you'd like to get to the website to be able to order the book. And you'll also see that on this flyer, there is a special discount code that is available through the press. If you enter Timber, I will also put the link in the chat for those who are interested in the book. So without further ado, it is a great pleasure for me to turn the screen over to Dahlia Scheindlin and learn from her. Please, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Avinoam. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you to the Political Science Department for inviting me, and also to our colleague, Jeremy, who's not here, unfortunately. And, thinking about the flyer of the book, which was launched yesterday, I'm thinking I should have changed one word. That point about clear paths forward, I'm not sure how clear the paths are forward, but I will try to look forward. What I want to try to do is begin with making sure we all know what we're talking about, because I can't assume that everybody's following all of the very dramatic, sometimes very in-depth ups and downs. So I want to situate what I see as the major framing questions of where we are now in Israel and what's happening. And then I'm going to try to give you the entire book in the middle part of my talk. Just kidding. I have to restrain myself from talking about the stuff that I found fascinating and could talk about for a long time, but I will try to highlight what I am arguing are the deep and long-term roots and precursors of the crisis that we're in now. Let me start by saying I do not see this democratic crisis in Israel as something that began in January when the current government announced its plans to reform, as they call it, as the protesters call it, overhaul or take over the judiciary. I did not see the crisis as beginning with the elections in November, nor do I see the crisis as having begun, for example, with the rule of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think the deep roots of this go way further back, and that's what I'll try to explore. And at the very end, all within half an hour, I will try to suggest what I think is, are the outlines or the guidelines for the way forward. So let me just, tell you the three guiding questions. To my mind, the first major question that everybody's asking, all of us here and many, if you're curious, I guess you're asking this too, is why did this government, just a few days after it was established, obviously the highest priority, announce a radical plan to constrain the independence of the Israeli judiciary and give the executive branch wide control over the judiciary, which Israelis immediately viewed as something like a constitutional coup? Why did the government do it? What is the government saying? Second, how did we get here? Not just in terms of which government was elected, because we can debate whether the government was elected on this policy or not. Many people think not. But never mind, why did Israel come to a point where so many political leaders thought that this was the main thing that had to happen? And third, of course, the title of this talk is Democracy Salvageable. I get that question a lot. Usually it's not quite so polite. People just say, what's going to happen? And I can't answer what's going to happen, but I will try to suggest an easy answer. Democracy is salvageable, I think, but the country has to really want to change. Let me also say something about how I got the idea to write this book. I thought, I got the idea in about 2 years ago in August 2021, and it emerged from almost identical questions. I was observing for about a decade what I considered to be a sustained, multi-directional, but politically driven attack on the Israeli judiciary for about 10 years. I had been writing about it, with accelerating pace, following what I saw as deeper and deeper attacks over that decade. Why did that attack catch on? Why did it gather such momentum among political communities in Israel? And could Israel survive it? Could Israel's democracy survive those attacks? So I would say, just to make the point again, that none of this started with the current government. I was already pretty advanced in at least the diagnosis of the problem about 2 years ago. And so much of the book, in a way, is in dialogue, with the exploration of the roots of this, of the kinds of arguments that are being made now, and trying to understand, what's real, which parts of these arguments have historic evidence, which don't. What is the motivation if they don't have historic arguments? And so let me map out some of those arguments, starting with that first question of why this government says it needs to do these things. The argument, very basic argument that the government is saying is that the court, the Israeli judiciary, but the Supreme Court in particular, has too much power. And therefore, in 2023, that they've been saying that for a long time. And over the current year, the main theme has been we are restoring or fixing the balance of power between the authorities of government. Another major narrative that the government, or argument, I should say, that the government is making, and many people agree, is that the court interferes and tramples the will of the Knesset by striking down laws or by ruling against executive action, even though the court is not elected and doesn't represent the people, and the Knesset, the elected authority, represents the people. And so the court is sort of enacting a kind of suppression of the will of the people, something very undemocratic. And a third major accusation is that the court invented these powers to interfere in legislation and executive action with no basis, and that's undemocratic. That it itself was a disturbance of the constitutional order prior to when the court became more interventionist or activist. They say that that was an undemocratic constitutional revolution that nobody really paid attention to until the court began undermining the will of the people as expressed in elections. And those are what I would consider the constitutional arguments that this government is making, but they really touch on themes that run far deeper. They are darker, angrier, bigger social rifts in Israeli life. So it's not, beyond, again, below the level of the questions of constitutional authority. I think we can break down those deeper thematic problems into two major ones, two or more, depending on how you count. The court is imposing a liberal universalist, and when they're being very explicit, a left-wing worldview on the public, including when the court pushes back against government action or legislation, and that is their personal preferences, not the preference of the Israeli people as expressed through Israeli lawmakers. And the second, of course, is very related. It's another one of these deeper themes, and that's that the court, the Supreme Court, and maybe the judiciary at large, represents an old, obsolete, shrinking, and arrogant elite that is sometimes explicitly named as Ashkenazi, secular, left-wing, and that community in Israel always looked down on the people, and the people who are who now have the electoral upper hand are right-wing, nationalist, committed to the Jewish identity of the state, and these, embittered, shrinking elites have been routed from the ballot box. They can't win elections, and so they are trying to cling to power through the only institution they can, and that's through the judiciary or the legal establishment. Those are the arguments that the government is making, or higher or lower figures in government, and other people who agree with the government, whether it's political commentators, media supporting this way of thinking, and they have been making these arguments for a long time. So how did we get here? Why do these themes have so much resonance? And here's where I began my exploration for the book. And let me just give you a few kind of preliminary, markers for what I'm talking about when I talk about democracy. Okay. Surely people will say, well, what am I referring to exactly? Democracy has, various interpretations. And I will admit very openly that my understanding of democracy is a representative government that also preserves the rights of individuals. Representative government expressed through elections, a liberal order with institutions to protect individual rights, civil rights, the kinds of rights that make people's free choice meaningful. I don't think you can separate the electoral exercise, which some people call rule of the majority, but I think that's a misleading approach. You can't separate that from having the civil rights to a free society where people can express their opinions and debate them and write about them and start political parties and compete. And so I think those two go together. But of course, my view wasn't always the common view. And I do try to situate the book in the historical phases. So it's challenging, but we have to remember that in the pre-war era, in the late 19th century, when Zionism was emerging, in the pre-state era, democracy, the word democracy was often considered simply majority rule. These ideas changed over time. And the idea that countries had to be democratic really only became part of the global currency in the post-war era, or let's say it was moving towards that, but there was a transition in how the world saw democracy. The idea of a constitutional liberal order became much more common after the Second World War, and we'll talk about how it became even more, I would say the establishment of those kinds of democracies accelerated after waves of decolonization and the 70s, 80s, but particularly the 90s. And now, as we all know, we all discuss, we are witnessing an era where many countries in the world seem to be undergoing an illiberal, attack on these democratic norms, and that we talk about those in terms of backsliding and erosion of democracy. But that doesn't mean democracy's gone. More countries are still democratic today than 100 years ago, but we are seeing some sort of pushback against that. So I look at democracy in the way I just explained, but I do accept that as Israel is coming into existence, it was part of its global context. Now, this is the challenging part. I can't go through the entire book, but I do want to argue that there are phases throughout Israeli history and that we can draw a certain kind of arc. I think that I had to start the book at early Zionism because I thought you have to understand that before there was a state, originally I thought I'll just start with statehood when the country has its own, authority over its own institutions. But I think the ideas that drove the Israeli state are important and the global context. Let's just summarize it and say that pre-state Zionist ideology was committed to lots of things, and democracy was never the primary ideology for most of the main streams of Zionist leaders. I say most because there was one who was a little bit more committed to a very sophisticated and developed version of liberal democracy, and that was Jabotinsky. But the leading forces of pre-state Zionism, what became the Mapai movement, David Ben-Gurion, they were committed to Zionism, they were committed to socialism, they were committed to convincing the international community, and that's what led to, I would argue, a somewhat instrumental version of democracy, in which as the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish entity, came closer and closer to realizing its vision, it became clear that the international community would recognize the state if it could prove that it would be democratic. And what kind of democracy did the international community want? Well, all you have to do is read UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which not only stipulates the partition plan as we know it, but also a very liberal democratic constitution that must be written by the two states that were supposed to come into existence, and ultimately voted on by an elected authority. And it calls for election. In other words, the United Nations put down this condition of democracy. Israel reflected back those commitments in the Declaration of Independence, although, interestingly, the word democracy was removed from the draft of the Declaration of Independence, but the spirit and certainly the actual commitments demanded in UN Resolution 181, the partition plan for what amounts to democratic values and democratic institutions, were there. I only am stopping to mention the Declaration of Independence, not just to get stuck on every little detail, but because this was a major part of the conversation in the Supreme Court last Tuesday, which I attended and watched for at least, it seemed to me, at least an hour, if not more. I mean, they kept going back to it, was about the authority of the Declaration of Independence. And did it truly confer democracy in a Jewish state? And so these historic debates are not just theoretical, they are still informing where things are today. Let me go through what I see as an arc. And the reason I call it an arc is because in some ways, democracy has evolved over time. And the major way it's evolved is that in the earliest years, the earliest decades of statehood, and particularly the earliest years, Israel was at its least democratic. If you hear the democracy protesters saying we need to go back to the way things were, they probably don't mean to the 1950s. Israel declined to pass a constitution or wasn't able to. We adopted these basic laws as a substitute, but never defined them, leaving out entirely a Bill of Rights. After independence, about half of the original Palestinian refugees were either expelled or fled after independence. In other words, theoretically, they might have been citizens, except that Israel didn't define citizenship at all for another 4 years, and nobody had a Bill of Rights. And the remainder of the Palestinian citizens, Arab citizens of Israel, were placed immediately under a martial regime that long outlasted the assessments that it was needed for security purposes. So you have a society that holds elections from the start and universal suffrage. So you have contradictory characteristics in this early phase, but a deeply undemocratic practice for about 15% of the population, long after the time when it was even understood as a security need. A lot of disenfranchisement going along with that, but I want to make another point. And again, the reason I'm spending more time on these early years is because I would argue the same kinds of characteristics have continued in various ways to crop up over time, leading to Israel's crisis today. So on one hand, there was the ambiguity, promising democratic governance in some ways, but declining to pass a constitution, completely abandoning the work of a Bill of Rights, putting part of the population under martial law, which is not even trying to be democratic, it's completely authoritarian. On the other hand, it's universal suffrage for everybody, but I would argue under conditions in which everybody's civil rights were curtailed for the lack of a political anchor. And that's another point I want to make. This isn't only an argument that that it wasn't Jewish and that the state wasn't democratic enough just for the Arab Palestinian citizens. We have a lawmaker today, Ahmed Tibi, who likes to say this quip: Israel is democratic for Jews and Jewish for Arabs. It's funny, but back then it wasn't nearly as democratic for any of its citizens because they had no constitutional anchor for their basic human rights. In addition, the political culture was such that one party, Ben-Gurion's party, dominated not only the political system for almost 30 years. That party won every election, and I would argue because the electoral environment wasn't truly free, because they dominated pretty much everything else. The party dominated the major labor union, which dominated the job market, which dominated people's access to healthcare. So you had to join the labor union to get the healthcare, and then you were under the political rubric of the ruling party. There was much overlap between the party and the army. And this party had made the deal with the religious authorities that certain parts of the public sphere and private life would be governed by religious authority. So no separation of religion and state. There was intense de facto discrimination against Mizrahi immigrants from Middle East and North Africa. And all of these things, you could say, well, it was the early years of statehood, birth pangs. I'm not really here to judge it. So, I mean, of course, I have my own normative assessment of these things, but you could argue that in the early years of statehood, everything is so chaotic, it would have been impossible to get beyond all that, to not have these kinds of problems. What I'm arguing is that some of these patterns, some of the ambiguity, the compromised practice of democracy for some citizens and not others, the acceptance of that compromised democracy by the majority, and normalizing the lack of a constitutional basis for civil rights, those patterns were set in the earliest years, including the ambiguity, the fact that this affects Jews as well, and the fact that there is an attempt of the ruling party to keep lots of control. So that's why I've spent a lot of time on this early part of statehood. I'll have to skip over, the other eras, but the arc moves towards democracy in the 1960s, late 60s and 70s for Israeli citizens. The military government ends, Israeli civil society becomes more independent, the media becomes more independent, less attached to parties. The judiciary becomes more active in pushing back against government and sometimes even legislation, even though those are very, very piecemeal moments. But let me point out that, from 1953 already, we had the court ruling against what it saw as executive action that would have violated freedom of the press. But Israel doesn't have a law on freedom of the press. The court ruled that in a democracy, there must be freedom of the press. This is a key example. It's called the Kol Ha'am case, and it's very early, you can hear, 1953, of when establishing democratic norms and constitutional norms fell to the Supreme Court. And this is also something that goes back to the earliest years of statehood. It's not a recent development, 1969, okay? The first time a court ever struck down a law. And the Supreme Court ruled against that law because it would have violated the equality of political competition between political parties. So these things were in place oftentimes because of lack of legislation that the Knesset simply declined, to pass these kinds of laws to anchor these democratic principles. But again, over time, civil society develops, the media becomes more active, the more independent judiciary becomes more active. And of course, the military government over Arab citizens eventually ends, but almost immediately the occupation begins, and thus Israel's most enduring undemocratic project begins, but it's very much a continuation of the practices that were going on almost the entire time up until 1967, when the citizens were living under a military regime and colonial law. So over time, the world moves towards liberal democracy. As I argued, the courts continue to become somewhat more active. Israel passes its first piecemeal basic laws in 1992. That is, the Knesset, the elected lawmakers, establish part of what would have been a Bill of Rights. The court interprets those as conferring the authority to push back against legislation, to strike down legislation that violates people's rights. And thus, we begin the tension over people increasingly seeking support through the Supreme Court by petitioning the Supreme Court and setting up the contradictions that we have today. I should really say the conflicts. That's what they are. The court begins to rule increasingly in favor of challenges to the status quo over religion and state, in favor of greater separation. The court increasingly rules for gender equality, LGBT rights, and almost never rules against the state when it comes to occupation, but a very, very incidental, occasional rulings in favor of petitioners against occupation policies mean that anti-occupation activists begin moving towards the court. And this pits all of those people who would prefer for Israel to be more religious in its public life, in its private life, for Israel to maintain its control over the occupied territories, eventually annex, build more settlements, for people who would prefer for Jews to have formally more privileges among Israeli citizens. It pits that group against the people who think that Israel should be preserving human rights, restraining its undemocratic project of how it governs, non-citizens, Palestinians, under military law, and seeks things like equality or individual rights or gender equality, and the kinds of things that characterize these two communities in Israel. And so this takes shape over time as a fight against the court. But I would argue the court has been thrust into this position because it was the Knesset and the elected lawmakers who in many ways throughout history declined to rule, sometimes declined to make laws, I should say, sometimes on specific issues. For example, the Knesset always kind of fudging the question about whether ultra-Orthodox should be drafted, and sometimes on big issues. For example, the Knesset has never legislated the equality of all citizens in Israel. You won't find that in Israeli legislation, only in the Declaration of Independence. Now, I have to skip, more specific historic elements, but I do want to end off by saying that that's the background to the current argument. The government has made it very clear that it believes the judiciary should be restrained. And you can see the protest that's been going on all year because people feel the judiciary, and particularly the court, has upheld those democratic values over time. It is incontrovertible that there has been progress among Israeli citizens from those earliest years to now. We have a very independent media, of course, subject to all the usual commercial pressures and increasingly pressures from the government, which would like to constrain the independence of the media, but they are still very independent. We have, frankly, an enviable civil society, very independent, very active, representing many different political streams, addressing pretty much every issue you can think of in Israeli life. Decades of citizen struggles have led to enormous openings in terms of access to information. I think that anybody, everything that I've told you today, 90% of it came from public sources. I'm embarrassed to say how much I found in terms of my research just from my computer, with an internet connection, but so much is accessible. And a judiciary that has become increasingly active over the years in setting limits to state power, striking down legislation that violates individual rights, and has operated on the assumption of independence. And of course, elections, which are critical to democracy, they tend to be process of integrity, and usually they're fair and all too frequent in this country. So I think that Israel is democratic enough to have become starkly aware of the undemocratic direction it was taking. It's democratic enough to do better and to know better. I'll stop here. I'm sure I talked too long, but I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dahlia, for offering some insight and some historical context. I see that some people have already started to type questions into the chat. Rather than unmuting people, I will ask people to type their questions into the chat, and that way we'll try to get to as many questions as we can as time allows. So I'll start, and then I'll start to take questions that have come in through the chat. As a historian, I appreciate the ways in which you've added great historical context to the present moment to suggest that it's not just something that's happened over the last year or two, or not just since the new government was elected in January, and not necessarily just connected to the trials of Bibi and sort of this exit strategy that we might see through the court, that there's a much broader context. And I'm sure people will have questions about the current moment. But you mentioned, and I think it might be interesting for the audience to learn about this, you mentioned that there was discussion in the early years of the state of creating a constitution to sort of root and anchor this democracy and democratic ideals and principles. And now in so we had this spectacle last week of the government basically arguing to weaken the Supreme Court before the Supreme Court, so setting up this conflict. And some have proposed the idea of, again, having a constitutional convention to sort of as a way out. So can you tell us a little bit more about what were the conflicts that prevented the passing of a constitution in the early years of the state, and why those conflicts or the existing conflicts wouldn't prevent a constitution from being established in the present moment?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let me just say that there were rather beautiful constitutional drafts that were prepared even ahead of independence, again, on the understanding that the United Nations had obligated the country through Resolution 181, and that, some of the leaders even thought that it would be a requirement to be accepted to the UN. So there were very robust and very elaborate and very learned drafts of the constitutions. They went through the Constitutional Committee of the Provisional Authority after independence. They were debated at the Constitutional Committee of the original Constituent Assembly, and again, I skipped over this, but the first election was held for a Constituent Assembly, which was tasked with writing that constitution. That Constituent Assembly lasted about a day before it adopted its first and only law, transforming itself into a regular legislature, and continued to debate constitutional drafts throughout 1950. But the reasons why Israel didn't end up adopting any of them are manifold, and I would say that let me set up the two main characters here. One was the Cherut Party, which was the party, that carried the legacy of Jabotinsky, and they were deeply committed to, again, a liberal constitutional order because they believed in individual rights much more than the collective socialist rights. They were also the despised political minority, and they wanted protections. They wanted rights for minorities, for minority parties, for political opposition. And so they supported a constitution, and this is very interesting to read the protocols at the time. The figure who was most against a constitution by the time of independence, or certainly after, was David Ben-Gurion. And the reasons why he was against it have been heavily debated. I can count 3 or 4 reasons, and then only question is which one was the dominant one. One is knowing that the ultra-Orthodox parties, and to some extent the religious Zionist parties, although the religious Zionists also played a key role in developing constitutional drafts, so that's not a clear-cut position, but certainly the ultra-Orthodox party, Agudat Yisrael, was dead set against the adoption of a document that would draw its authority from the people. Authority is supposed to come from God. It would establish secular law. It would establish things like equality on the level of gender. It might establish separation of religion and state. They could not tolerate it. Ben-Gurion certainly didn't want to risk their participation, not in the pre-statehood negotiations with the international community, which led to the status quo, and not after independence, when in the earliest years they were in the coalition. And so that's one reason. Another reason is that, we don't have this on record, but if you're enacting a martial regime, a military regime, based on colonial laws that Israel simply absorbed after independence, draconian colonial emergency regulations that were originally used to crush the Jewish battles against the British, it would be harder to do that if you guarantee a Bill of Rights for all your citizens. And in any case, if you have a constitution, you have to define citizens, and citizens are all supposed to be equal. All of that would be hard to maintain, or the military regime would be harder to maintain if you had an anchor for those kinds of rights. And I think, let's say the main, you can say what Ben-Gurion argued. What he argued publicly was that we're not ripe for it. We haven't had the ingathering of the exiles yet. He thought about democratic theory and argued that today's generation should not constrain the nature of society in the future, lawmakers in the future. He said it's undemocratic to have some laws be higher than others. But that's, again, let's say that's a third reason, what he argued publicly. But what, I think the way I interpret it is that he did not want constraints on his power, on executive power. He did not want a court intervening. I've even heard the theory that from the earliest days, the Supreme Court, which was established almost immediately, indicated that it would be activist, that it might push back on government action, and that he realized that this would be a challenge to his power. I can't prove that. I haven't seen the documentation, but it's a logical, consistent observation. And that he wanted if you're going to be generous, you could say he wanted the room for maneuver and the leeway to build a new state facing enormous challenges, being at war, absorbing huge amounts of immigrants from all parts of the world with different cultural backgrounds, all the things we know. Or you could simply say he wanted the country to be dominated by his party. And so all of those things fed into his opposition to a constitution, which then heavily influenced his party, which was the dominant party. Okay, and ultimately the decision was made to have this compromise. The compromise being the piecemeal basic laws, which were to be passed bit by bit, chapter at a time, law at a time, defining the authorities of government and eventually a Bill of Rights that would lead up to a future constitution. But only the only basic law, first basic law was only passed 10 years later. And even that was defining the Knesset. And then you had laws defining other institutions. And you had some more political basic laws, but nothing defining individual rights or human rights in Israel until 1992. And every time, I should mention, every generation, every decade, there were lawmakers who tried to draft and advance a Bill of Rights in the legislative process. And each time it fell, usually at the committee stage, largely because either the ruling Mapai didn't want it in the early years, when the people who proposed it were the small liberal party and which eventually joined Likud, or because they knew that they didn't want to, incur the pushback, the resistance of the Orthodox parties, which continued even after Likud took power. So every decade, I would say, there are lawmakers who tried to pass at least a Bill of Rights, which together with the institutional basic laws could have added up to a constitution, but they never managed to do it because Israel doesn't want to decide. It prefers to live in a gray zone when it comes to some of those key issues I mentioned. The equality of all citizens, borders, right? Which people are included under the Israeli constitutional regime and who is not. The role of religion and state. Is there separation of religion and state? Do people have freedom of and from religion? And the question of whether Jews are privileged above all others in society. Those are the things Israel's never wanted to either decide or never wanted to declare. And you would have to do that if you pass a constitution. And it hasn't been able to this day.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, one of the fascinating things that you're pointing out is sort of this tendency to avoid or deny or push those difficult decisions down the road, right? We see this sort of repeated tendency, which lies within this, you said maybe not a contradiction, but a conflict, between these different entities, but also the central question, which keeps coming up between Jewish and democratic. And that, I'm looking at some of the questions that have started to come in. So Ruth asks a question which I think gets to the tension between Jewish and democratic. Ruth asks, can I ask whose rights would need to be protected for a society to be a democracy? In your view, the citizens of that society, all people under the control of that society, or its institutions, or some other category of people? And one of the things that you've alluded to is sort of this question which continues to be avoided, of what to do about the Palestinians, what to do about the Palestinians who are under the control of Israel but are not citizens of the state, as opposed to the Palestinian citizens of Israel who live within the pre-67 boundaries, right? So can you say a little bit more about sort of that tension between Jewish state, democratic state? I think you mentioned the Ahmed Tibi quote of, democratic for Israeli, Jewish for Palestinians, I think is the quote, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. So please. Yeah.
Okay, the quote, at least as it's attributed to him, I didn't hear him say it myself, but we always repeat this, is that he said, Israel is democratic for Jews and it's Jewish for Arabs. Okay. In other words, the Jewish citizens enjoy most of the fruits of democracy throughout Israel's history, even though I would argue that without a constitution and without these kinds of decisions, it's not democratic enough. But it's the Arabs who live under a Jewish state and they feel that lack of equality. I think that's what he meant. Absolutely. I mean, the tension between a Jewish state and democracy, it's almost impossible to discuss unless you know what you mean when you're talking about a Jewish state. I mean, I tried to open with a very, very quick definition of what I am talking about when I talk about democracy, representative government and protections, institutional protections for individual rights. I argued that these were inextricable. What do we mean when we say Jewish state? So of course this comes up in Israeli law and policy, and the first time that Israel established in its constitutional level law, right, basic law, which has normative status but no special process for passing or canceling those laws. The first time that came up was in 1985, when Israel changed its basic law of the Knesset and its electoral law within that to say that any party can be banned if it undermines a Jewish state or a democratic state, later amended to be undermining a Jewish and democratic state. These things are certainly in tension, but I would say they would be in tension no matter where Israel's borders are. Okay, you will have to live with that tension. And Israel will have to decide if it defines Jewish state in a way that does not encroach on democratic values, or if it insists on a definition of Jewish state that effectively, whether it says so or not, effectively gives institutionalized privileges to Jews, which is essentially the way things are now. Okay, most of the laws don't openly say this law applies to Jews and not Arabs, or Arabs and not Jews, but they can often be worded in a way where it is almost explicit. And I've written about this in recent months about this government. Sometimes it's explicit in the explanations of the law. Sometimes the laws are tailored in ways that they apply very clearly to one population or the other. If that's the definition of Jewish state, it contradicts democracy. It contradicts the Jewish and democratic part of that equation. That is a question no matter where Israel's borders are. It applies to all citizens. So who needs these protections? Anybody governed by the country in a permanent way. That would be my answer. I mean, yes, states make a contract with the people who are their citizens, but a democratic state doesn't control people permanently. Okay, and I use that word advisedly. This is a long conversation. People who don't have protections and rights and who are not being controlled of their own free will. Now, apropos the gray zone, it doesn't stop with Israel's lack of a constitutional decision. The next major refusal to decide happens in 1967. Israel conquers territories and refuses to really tell itself what it wants to do with them. Excuse me. Levi Eshkol is this great figure in this drama of being remembered as the most indecisive prime minister. There's a joke that he could never take a shower because he did not know whether to choose the cold water or the hot water tap back in those days. But I think and I write this in the book, I think it's an unfair critique. Israel never wanted to make that decision public. It never wanted to say, not to itself, not to the Palestinians, not to the international community, we will be keeping this land. Now, did it know that in the very beginning? Maybe not. Maybe Eshkol really hadn't decided. But Eshkol died quickly after the war. And to this day, Israel hasn't made its decision. At least it hasn't made it public. Although over the last 10, 15 years, that decision has become so clear. And the leading powers in Israel, the right-wing parties, whether it's Likud, the secular right-wing party, or the religious right-wing parties, these are the parties in power, and they say very openly, there will not be a Palestinian state, there will not be division of the land, there will not be Palestinian independence. They openly call for sovereignty. It's only a matter of what it looks like, and where specifically at any given time. So, I mean, at this point, the government has been so open about it, and the leading parties and the leading figures have been so open about it, that I don't think there should be any debate that Israel is permanently in control of the Palestinians. Is that reversible? The Saudis are now putting on the table some sort of a conversation about a two-state solution again, maybe, but it looks very remote. Nothing is impossible. Never say never. We learn this in politics. But the amount of time and the clearly stated intention to continue the way things have been, which is effectively total Israeli oversight or control over all elements of Palestinian life, except for those that are just barely outsourced at the very local level. If that's the case for 56 years, and the government is stating its intention to continue that way, then it must decide if it's going to be a democratic state, it has to protect those rights. It has to anchor those rights for all people it controls, not only citizens. If it doesn't want to do that, then it has to decide that those aren't it's not governing those people anymore, controlling, I should say.
Right. Now, there is this tension between Jewish democratic and greater Israel, right? You can't have all three things. So there has to be a decision that's made. And as you have eloquently pointed out, the decision is not to make a decision, right? So if you keep punting down the road or kicking the can down the road, eventually there are consequences to the decision not to make a decision.
Although again, I would argue that at this point, the decision has been made. The decision has been made and is even openly said in many, many ways, sometimes very explicitly. And I think that The idea that Israel hasn't decided at this point, at least about the fate of the Palestinians, is no longer the reality. This government, by the way, one of the most interesting things about this government is that it has said it more openly than anybody else. In some ways, this government has revealed very explicitly policies that have been implemented for many years. Sorry, I do want to hear more questions.
Yeah, no, so I'll get to that because I want to make sure to get to these other questions, and then I'll try to insert some of those threads as well. So there's a few questions that have come in about the Supreme Court in general. One, you spoke about sort of a little bit about the history of the Supreme Court, but I think it might be interesting. So my colleague Yoni Miller writes in and says, how and when was the Supreme Court founded? What powers, if any, were arrogated to it when it was founded, and by whom? And I'll combine that with a question that came in from Philip Mannheim, who asks, shouldn't changing the basic law or overruling the Supreme Court require a supermajority in the Knesset, say 70 votes? So can you tell us a little bit more about the history of the Supreme Court and what the intent was of the nature of its, supposed to be the nature of its relationship to the Knesset, how that power dynamic was supposed to function, and how it has unfolded in practice?
Yeah, let me start by, very, very brief history. The court was established almost immediately upon statehood. I should note that the chief rabbis boycotted the ceremony because they were defiantly, bitterly opposed to the idea of establishing a court, a higher court for civilian law. But there was no actual law passed defining the court until 1953. That's the Judges' Law, which defined how the judges were to be chosen. And then 1950, I believe 57, the law of the courts, but it was a general law establishing the rest of the court system. No basic law, none of these semi, quasi, crypto higher laws, future constitutional legislation, pieces of legislation. No basic law defined the judiciary until 1984. So from 1948 through 1984, there was no basic law establishing really what the Supreme Court and the judiciary as a whole was. And the main thing that I think establishes the relationship between the court that's in the basic law of the judiciary is Article 15, which says that the court is the place to go for those who might have been injured by, including by administrative action, to seek relief and justice. And that essentially means that the court, that it's recognized that the court can rule against executive action. I'm not sure if that counts. I'm not enough of I'm a political scientist, and I had to do a lot of, crash course in legal thinking. Does that really count as conferring judicial review over administrative action? I think pretty much. And again, since 1953, the court had effectively been ruling against executive overreach. For example, that was the case I mentioned when the government tried to suspend the publication of a newspaper that it didn't like. I probably wouldn't have liked it either. It was a really very radical communist paper, but nevertheless, not that I wouldn't have liked it, but it was publishing certain things that really were offensive and probably lies. But the court intervened ever since that time. And the idea that the court could review government action on behalf of citizens is recognized in the basic law of the judiciary, but that's only in 1984. There is no law explicitly saying that the court has the right or power to review legislation. Again, the court did it once in 1969 on a specific ad hoc basis and never indicated that it had a general right to do so. It said, no, this one law violates another law, but here's how you can change it and do it and pass it, to reflect the will of the Knesset. The Knesset began to assert the authority of judicial review of legislation only after the Knesset, the lawmakers, passed those human rights laws, and they were basic laws, in 1982. The Knesset amended them in 1992. Did I say 82? 1992. And the Knesset amended them 2 years later in 1994. Neither of those pieces of legislation explicitly said judicial review. The earlier drafts that had begun this whole process in the late 1980s and 90s did, but they knew it was very controversial, and along the way through several Knesset seatings, that idea was dropped, and it was intended to be put into a future basic law of legislation, which we still don't have. But judicial review was removed as an explicit right in those laws. However, other aspects, other articles in those human rights laws signaled that the laws could not be violated. Okay, and the court interpreted this, and this was made more explicit in the 1994 amendments, to the point where the lawmakers in the protocols, not me, Dahlia, in the protocols, certain lawmakers said, we have now conferred, recognized the right of the court to strike down legislation that violates human rights. That's a great advance for human rights. And the person who said it was a Likud legislator. Okay, that was 1994. 1995, the court issues a ruling in which it says we have the authority to strike down laws that violate human rights. Doesn't actually do it. And the first time the court does it is 1997. So from 1992 to 1997, the Knesset knew, all the lawmakers knew that the court might, and then definitely asserted that it would strike down legislation that violated the Knesset's own legislation guaranteeing human rights. If the Knesset had wanted to change that situation, it could have for those 5 years. It could have ever since, and it hasn't. So the big debate right now is, does the court have that right? Has it overused that right? The court has, since 1995, when it declared the authority in principle, and since 1997, when it first did it, the court has struck down 23 either articles of legislation, a clause or an article, and very rarely, very occasionally, a full piece of legislation. Altogether, 23 times in almost 30 years. So by most international comparisons, that's normal to low. Okay. The court does also strike down administrative action, government executive action. That's why one of the first thing this government was able to do was try to remove one of the tools the court has used to judge government action as unreasonable. That applies only to executive action. So all of these things are subject to debate. I mean, I see it as a fairly clear story. I tried to argue that story in the book based on how I understood the lawmakers saw it at the time. But certainly I wouldn't convince anybody in this government that the Supreme Court has legitimate authority granted by the lawmakers to review their own actions.
Thank you. And it's, again, very, very helpful to have the historical context and to clarify sort of the nature of that relationship. I want to go back. There's a question that Ralph has asked that picks up on some of your points about, let's say, the peace process, the one state versus two state solution. Ralph disagreed with a point that you made about, I think, about sort of the degree to which Israel's relationship to the post-67 territories was debated or not. So Ralph writes, Israel's rule over the post-67 territories was hotly and violently debated in the 1990s and early 2000s under Rabin, Barak, Olmert, and even under Sharon, who said in 2005 that Israel should not rule over another people. And I think, part of the question is, just given that this current government is sort of openly stating its desire to once and for all sort of resolve the status, annex the territories, make them part of Israel, let's say, and sort of kill the two-state solution once and for all, some commentators have noted that the protest movement, while initially starting as sort of a reaction to what seemed to be this extreme judicial reform policy overhaul coup that comes under various different terms, has evolved into a movement that realizes to a certain extent that it was simply impossible to essentially live sort of in the bubble, let's say Tel Aviv, ignoring what was happening in the territories, and that this movement is now paying much closer attention, or perhaps on a political level, wanting to, or perhaps in the future, will deal with the situation in different ways, realizing that it can no longer be ignored. So to what extent do you think this is true? Do you think that has this opened up sort of new political possibilities for what might happen in the territories, pushing back against sort of a government that is trying to effectively end the possibility of a two-state solution? Or am I overreading what might be happening in the current moment?
Is that your question now, or or the original? Was it Ralph who asked that question? That you extended?
We have Ralph's question, and then we have Avi's midrash and Ralph's question.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, I'm sorry to disappoint Ralph, but I completely agree. I mean, I just had to skip over big swaths of Israeli history. I mean, of course, in the 1990s, I think this is integral, and it's a big chapter in my book, that during this phase of the 1990s, the entire, this was kind of the heyday when liberal democracy is kind of spreading and accelerating, I should say. That was like when the international indices measured the most number of liberal democracies. It makes sense. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Those countries some of them were trying to move towards liberal democracy. And Israel too saw among its most liberal moments as many things changed: the economy, the structure, the political structure, the economy, the advances of the basic laws. And I think there was a general kind of reigning impression, certainly Labor Party, okay, which had been out of power since 1977, or sort of competing in these very, paralyzed coalitions of parity in the 1980s. Labor comes back to power, having completely transformed itself from the old socialist / statist Mapai into a liberal party. That's an enormous transformation. Labor now stands for liberal values, okay, liberal economy, liberal individual rights, basically moving towards where Meretz, the position on the map where Meretz lies. And so Labor, basically, the leadership of Labor at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, but also Shimon Peres is very prominent. They ultimately come to believe that Israel cannot be a liberal democratic society unless it gives up its control over the Palestinians and makes a decision on this issue. And for them, that was also key to Israel's global integration, which was key to its economic advancement, which is key to individual rights and protections and freedom, of all citizens to choose their path and have, accumulate their own wealth and property. And so all of these things go together. And they believe that they must ultimately resolve the problem, or at the very least end the occupation, in order to fulfill what I have called in the book Israel's democratic promise, and they would probably call it something similar, but they would add to be a Jewish and democratic state also because of the demographic reasons. Now that process, generates all of the, violent rifts that we know. I do make the argument in the book that the occupation advances undemocratic policy for the Palestinians, but also supports undemocratic values and practice among Israelis. And there's no better example of this than the use of violence to make a political case, which is what happened, around the issue of occupation. Of course, it was around the peace process, and that's the assassination of the prime minister. After that, then you have the disengagement, which of course arose from pretty much the same way of thinking, that Israel had to try to roll back this quagmire in order to advance as a Jewish and democratic society, but also to fulfill, again, these what they saw as Israel's emerging global positioning and its liberal direction at the time, still sort of at the time. But that creates even a deeper rift and a backlash among the religious communities and some of the right-wing security-oriented communities. And then all of it collapses, during the Second Intifada, after the disengagement, okay? And so I think that the big paradigm shift under the Netanyahu governments since 2009 is that the disconnect between what he sees as a democracy, and for parts of his leadership, even a liberal democracy, not being connected to the continuation of occupation. In other words, from Netanyahu's perspective, Israel can achieve all of its goals, including being a relatively liberal democratic society for at least its citizens, and not have to end its control over the territories. And that is a major paradigm shift. Now, he's been winning elections and his parties have been in power and his coalitions have led this country for the last 14 years. So I can't say he's wrong, but I can say he's wrong about the democratic aspect of it, because here we are with, the country's leadership trying to undermine democratic institutions, largely in order to advance the open agenda of annexation, among the other aspects I mentioned. So, the question of the protests, we've all been waiting all year to find out if this would be a major change in how many people understand that democracy is connected to the occupation. And so far, I'm putting on my pollster hat, not imposing my own impressions or even my anecdotal impressions, nor my desire. What I see in survey research is that very little has changed for Israelis in terms of their understanding that the occupation is something completely separate from these internal issues. I would dispute internal. There is no internal or external when the green line is mostly gone. And Israeli citizens, we have almost 500,000 Israeli citizens living in the West Bank, another 250,000 in East Jerusalem. So never mind, I don't see any change, empirical change that I can pick up in my survey research, not in terms of how Israelis identify as right, left, or center, which is always about the conflict, or in terms of actual policies. I don't see that change yet. And there is a large portion of Israelis I've seen in surveys who say the two issues are not connected. Although, well, it depends on how you ask the question. There was one survey, and I give a boost to my colleagues over at Mitvim, the foreign policy think tank, who had a survey showing that nearly half of Israelis think that there is a connection between the judicial overhaul and the annexationist open intentions of this government. But that has not really reflected in the protest movement, other than the very, very stalwart, consistent presence of anti-occupation activists every week, and some, appearance of the issue in the speeches, including from the main stages. But I haven't seen it, undergo some real shift towards being a more prominent part of the argument from the side of the protesters.
Thank you. All right, I think if you're okay, we'll take one more question, sort of a wrap-up question, and then we'll allow you to wrap up. And I think this is a good question to conclude with. So this comes from Relly Coleman, who asks or suggests, we all agree that judicial reform is needed. As you've talked about, sort of there is this unclear boundaries definition of the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Knesset. There could be sort of reasons for having some sort of process to clarify. But Relly asks, why a push for unilateral changes, and specifically why now? The emphasis on now. So, can you say a little bit about why you think this is happening in 2023, and what this might have to do with Bibi's position, the political alignments that might be, and perhaps a nod to, I know we don't want to ask you to predict the future, but a nod to where things might go from here at this moment.
Well, let me first of all go back to one of the questions I forgot to answer, which was about whether, isn't it true that we should have a supermajority for overruling the Supreme Court? The answer is, of course, we should have a supermajority for overruling the Supreme Court, considering Israel's Supreme Court is kind of fulfilling the role of a constitution. I mean, we don't have a constitution, we have basic laws, the Supreme Court interprets them, and to overrule a Supreme Court decision, should take more than a simple majority. By the way, the Religious Zionist Party, in their platform, which was released two weeks before the elections in November, so they released it in mid-October, calls for what they call a regular majority, except that in Hebrew, rov ragil, a regular majority, means a majority of those present. In other words, it is written in their platform in black and white. I downloaded on PDF, so they can't deny it, that the Knesset should be able to override a Supreme Court ruling theoretically by 2-1. I even checked it with the person who was one of the prominent authors of that report, who has since become the chair of our Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, Simcha Rotman. He confirmed the idea was for a quorum. So, of course, I disagree with that approach, but just to answer that person's question. So we all agree judicial reform is needed. I would say that's a very loaded statement in the sense that it very much chooses a political side. The people who are saying we all agree judicial reform is needed are the supporters of this government. There are some people who are against what this government is doing, including law scholars and some citizens or prominent thought leaders who agree that some judicial reform is needed, even along the lines of what this government is doing, but certainly disagrees with the unilateral and rather extreme way this government is doing it. But I would say the vast majority of people who agree that there is some sort of judicial reform needed are talking about reform to the legal system in ways that serve the citizens directly. And the number one issue is that the justices are overloaded, cases are delayed, and justice is delayed for every citizen in the country. And there's, anybody who's ever had to deal with the judiciary feels that, absaro on our flesh, as we say. And so I think that, just to give you an example, I did a little pop survey of an anonymous list of people that I didn't know, a group of friends, friends who are on a group of WhatsApp group of lawyers. About 50 of them answered within 24 hours when I asked my friend to post, what are the changes you think we need to the judiciary? Just very neutral. And all these answers flooded in. People were passionate and said, tell your friend to interview me, and I would say only one of them out of about 50, these responses overnight said, oh, we should be reducing the use of the reasonability clause, which is the kind of constitutional change this government wants to propose. It all had to do with finding ways to reduce the load on the justices, to expedite justice, to make the legal representation better. Some of them said things like the justices should be less arrogant. That has to do with the lower courts. But so when we talk about agreeing that judicial reform is needed, I would say judicial reform is needed in ways that serve the citizens directly. And as for constitutional change, well, the reason why now is because you have a convergence of interests. The ultra-Orthodox have resented the court from the beginning, and particularly in the last couple of decades when the court has tried to press for equal treatment of all people in terms of the draft. And the Knesset has not wanted to legislate in that way. The national religious, specifically the pro-settler group within the national religious, who view the court as an enemy, even though really, if you look at court judgments, they have backed the vast majority. They have backed all of Israel's policies in the occupations, only occasionally ruling on a specific incident or specific case that sometimes is to the detriment of the settlers, with one exception, and that is that they completely struck down a law that would have legalized the possession of privately owned Palestinian land, and that was very recent. That was in 2020. But for the most part, the court backs the state on occupation. Nevertheless, the religious Zionist community has become used to seeing the court as an enemy when it comes to settlement. So they have been against the court for a long time. And of course, the prime minister enters the picture when really becomes the spokesperson for this deep state narrative of the elites, and the political persecution of the true people through the courts. That he begins making those kinds of statements around 2019 when he is formally indicted for 3 counts of corruption. Now, I don't think he's really wants to have, throw out his cases and think he's going to take over the judiciary and the Supreme Court and all of it will vanish. I don't think he really expects that. I think he wants to delegitimize the legal process. I think he's hoping maybe that there will be a way to get the attorney general out and install a good attorney general from his perspective who would drop the cases. Maybe he wants to help re-engineer judicial selection by changing the committee who selects the justices so that there would be friendly justices in case his cases reach appeals. He's being tried in a district court. Whatever judgment, if it's against him, they will appeal. So all of those things are somewhere behind his thinking, and all of those forces converged at once in 64 seats that Netanyahu and his supporters got on November 1st. They know that those 64 seats were almost a mathematical error. They won 48.3% of all votes cast. It's an opportunity they might not have again.
Okay, well, this has really been a fascinating and enlightening discussion, and I want to thank you and encourage the audience to join me in thanking you. We have a virtual round of applause. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insight on this topic, and what is a really complicated topic. I've dropped into the chat again the link to your newest book on the crooked timber of democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this program.
If I could just add one word, I don't expect people to all pay that steep academic cost, but if you're affiliated with institutions, ask your institutions to purchase it. And anybody who wants to be in touch with me, I won't have time to get the emails before the call drops. So please just feel free to reach out to Avinoam and you can put us in touch. Yeah.
Yes, by all means. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much also for being such a good audience and for hosting me.